All right, guys, so here we are in chapter 18, and chapter 18 is pretty intense. There's a lot going on, and so I've actually broken it down into sections so that each of these recordings hopefully will only be 10 or 15 minutes long. But you'll have quite a few recordings to get through to finish chapter 18. I'm also going to try to do the recordings a few different ways using different technology, and then we can kind of talk about what works best for you guys. Okay, so we're in the endocrine system, and really all that we're going to talk about in this video is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. Okay, so this is an image from a different textbook, but I thought it was a really key thing to understand the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the highest level of endocrine control. It basically runs everything else, which is kind of funny because a lot of people talk about this pituitary gland as being the master organ of the endocrine system, but truly, in reality, right, it's actually the hypothalamus that runs the show. Now, the hypothalamus really does three different things, right? It is truly an endocrine organ. The neurons in the hypothalamus actually are the ones that are producing antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. So these green neurons here, the cell body is where that hormone is produced, and then it travels down the axon and is able to be released into the posterior pituitary where it can be stored. Okay? The hypothalamus also secretes a lot of regulatory hormones. So the way that it controls the anterior pituitary gland is actually through these regulatory hormones. So here's a hint. Anytime you see yada yada releasing hormone or yada yada inhibiting hormone, those are hypothalamic regulatory hormones, and they're just trying to trigger or inhibit the release of hormones from the anterior pituitary. And then the third major thing that the hypothalamus does is really, remember, it's in the brain, it's part of the nervous system. And so it's actually part of the autonomic nervous system. And these neurons right here, you see the cell body, these axons reach directly down all the way to the adrenal medulla. Again, the adrenal gland sits right on top of the kidney, and it can trigger the release of epinephrine and norepinephrine from the adrenal gland. This is your fight or flight response. So that's a major kind of connection between the nervous system and the endocrine system. Okay? So the hypothalamus is super important. Oh, one thing I did want to point out is really to keep an eye on the fact that my old textbook, and I'll use a couple images, it has the brain facing the other way, right? So here's the anterior, the face of the brain, and the posterior, the back of the brain. And so here's our posterior pituitary lobe and our anterior pituitary. Your textbook, they're the opposite direction, so don't let me throw you off with that. Okay. I pulled this picture again because I really like the way this textbook did it. This is just to remind you, right, that the posterior pituitary gland, which again, in this book, this is the posterior pituitary gland. Notice these neurons reaching down, right, and delivering their hormones. That's going to go to the bloodstream and then to the rest of the body. When we look at the control of the anterior pituitary, it's actually through what we call a portal system, the hypophyseal portal system. Portal system. And a portal system is just really a capillary bed connected to another capillary bed through a couple what they're calling portal veins or portal vessels. This is unusual, right? Normally things go artery down to capillary and then to a vein. So this is unusual to have a capillary bed linked to a capillary bed, but that's how we see the control of the anterior pituitary taking place. Again, the image from your book trying to show you that those neurons go to the posterior pituitary gland. Remember, these two images were set differently. And again, that portal system, the blood vessels, using those regulatory hormones to control the anterior pituitary. Okay, big theme here, negative feedback. Most of the hormones in the endocrine system are going to be regulated by negative feedback. So again, this is from a different textbook, but I thought it had a really nice schematic here, right? So if we start up in the hypothalamus, whoop, that didn't work quite right, did it? Let's try again. If we start in the hypothalamus, right, we see a releasing hormone, and so we have an arrow, right? That releasing hormone is encouraging the release of hormone number 1 from the anterior pituitary, right? And they made this nice little chart, right? So in this case, thyrotropin releasing hormone would trigger the release. Here's hormone 1, a thyroid stimulating hormone, but this is kind of more general, right? That goes to an endocrine organ. Again, if we follow this example, that's the thyroid gland, right? And we release a second hormone. In this case, this example, thyroid hormone. And that hormone travels through the blood and impacts its target cells. Now, this idea of negative feedback, what we're looking at is once we have enough, say, thyroid hormone, right, we are going to tell this to the endocrine system by those levels of hormone. So if this is thyroid hormone, the negative feedback is just that circulating hormone. Can see how they put this little like stop sign here? It's not an arrow anymore. It's saying don't release any more thyroid stimulating hormone, right? Or sometimes that feedback will go all the way up to the hypothalamus and say no more of that thyrotropin releasing hormone, okay? And so that would lower the levels of the circulating hormone. When there's low enough levels, we no longer get that inhibition and we can start releasing hormones again. So again, negative feedback is going to be key here in the endocrine system. Okay, so again, thinking about the hypothalamus, table 18.1, this is out of your textbook, it tells you all the hormones of the hypothalamus. Now, basically what I'm going to tell you is anytime you see something that's such and such releasing hormone, you know it's from the hypothalamus. Such and such inhibiting hormone, you know it's from the hypothalamus. Gonadotropin releasing hormone, it's from the hypothalamus. So you don't really have to say memorize those so much. They all kind of have clues in their work, in their names, like growth hormone releasing hormone. It tells us to produce more growth hormone. Okay. When we get to the pituitary, it's a different story, right? There is a lot of hormones coming out of the pituitary. So let's take a look here. This table, again, is kind of separating for you the 2 hormones from the posterior pituitary and the more or less 7 hormones from the anterior pituitary. Okay, so when we look at the pituitary gland, okay, again, the hypothalamus is going to trigger or produce the 2 posterior pituitary hormones, antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Okay, so the posterior pituitary is also referred to as the neurohypophysis because it's actually these neurons that are directly delivering these neurohormones or neuropeptides. Okay. Antidiuretic hormone, basically, when it's released, it is going to help the kidney reabsorb water. So it tells you it is against antidiuresis, which is peeing. So it's the anti-peeing hormone. It tells you to hold on to water. So it's going to get released when solute concentrations or the osmolality of the blood increases, right? So if it gets salty, right? So you're running out of water. This makes perfect sense. There's actually osmoreceptors in the hypothalamus that sense this saltiness and tell us to release antidiuretic hormone. The hypothalamus can also respond to baroreceptors. These are pressure receptors, and so that's going to be sensing blood pressure. So if blood volume starts dropping, we can also release antidiuretic hormone and again decrease the amount of water lost by the kidneys, and so this is going to up the water in the blood plasma. At really high doses, antidiuretic hormone can also cause vasoconstriction. And so sometimes you'll see this, that's more in like a pharmacological use. You'll sometimes see it called vasopressin. At really high doses. Okay. Oxytocin is our other posterior pituitary hormone. And basically what we'll see here is that in females, it stimulates smooth muscle contractions of the uterus. So this is important in things like labor, menstruation, or orgasm. It also influences the function of the mammary glands. So it's responsible for what's called the milk letdown reflex. And so it doesn't tell the mammary glands to produce milk, but it opens up the ducts so that that milk can flow. And if you think about it, you're getting high levels of oxytocin during labor, during childbirth, and that's actually when we trigger the release of this milk for the newborn. It also is important in what we would call pair bonding. So whether maternal bonding with a baby, oxytocin is really important there. And then also, it seems like with sexual partners. In males, the role of oxytocin is a little less certain, but there's some thought that it might help the movement. Again, it's the smooth muscle contractions that might be helping to move, say, sperm and semen along the reproductive tract. And again, it may be important in bonding with a mate. Okay, so those were your two posterior pituitary hormones. The anterior pituitary gland, we got a lot here, so I'll try to speed this up a little bit. Okay, so again, we see a lot of different hormones coming off here. These are all in purple in this particular image. And let's look at what we got here. Again, remembering that the anterior pituitary gland, this is sometimes referred to as the adenohypophysis, and this comes actually from a totally different embryonic origin. So it is not nervous tissue, right? It's not neural, the way the posterior pituitary is, but it's actually epithelial in origin. It again is controlled by those hypothalamic regulatory hormones, and this picture is showing you that portal system, so those hormones can travel through these little blood vessels to the anterior pituitary. So it is highly vascular tissue. Okay, a lot of the hormones released from the anterior pituitary are referred to as tropic hormones. And this tropic, this just refers to the fact that they turn on other endocrine organs. So growth hormone, sometimes called somatotropin, I've always seen it called just growth hormone. It stimulates a lot of different cells in the body to grow and replicate, and it does this by increasing the rate of protein production. So it tells cells to uptake amino acids and build proteins. It also can encourage lipolysis, so the splitting of lipids in order to have more energy. So it does this in two different ways, right? And the primary way it does this is actually kind of indirectly. So notice in this image that growth hormone goes to the liver, and from the liver then we produce another, I guess hormone, I would call it, called a somatomedin. And these somatomedins, sometimes also called insulin-like growth factors, are going to go to a lot of different target cells and increase the amino acid uptake, right, and that protein production. And so we see that we're focusing in here on things like bone, muscle, and then it says other tissues. Connective tissue is a big one there as well. But growth hormone also can have some direct effects, right? It can go directly to tissues. So it can go to things like epithelium and connective tissue and really stimulate cell division or differentiation. It goes directly to adipose or body fat and stimulates that lipolysis. So it dumps all these fatty acids into the blood to be used as fuel. It has what we call a glucose-sparing effect because it tells cells essentially to use those fatty acids instead of glucose. And then when it goes to the liver, it can also stimulate glycogenolysis. The lysis, the splitting of glycogen, again, to release glucose into the bloodstream. Okay, so that is growth hormone. Prolactin, this one is much more straightforward. So prolactin is a hormone that stimulates mammary gland development and the production of milk. Right? So oxytocin did the milk letdown, but prolactin is the one actually telling us to produce milk. Again, this is under the control, all of these in the hypothalamus. So there's a prolactin releasing factor. Dopamine, interestingly, acts as the prolactin inhibiting hormone. And prolactin is pretty poorly understood, its role in males, because it is found in males as well. Okay, let's tackle another big one here. So ACTH, this is adrenocorticotropic hormone. And ACTH stimulates the adrenal cortex. So the outside of the adrenal gland is the adrenal cortex, and we'll get into that in more detail. But basically, we're looking at the adrenal cortex. It actually releases a few different classes of hormones, but in response to ACTH, it's releasing the glucocorticoids, in particular cortisol. And this is typically in response to some sort of environmental stress. You may have heard of cortisol as a stress hormone. Okay, FSH and LH, these are our gonadotropins. And so the gonadotropins are regulating the gonads, right? The ovaries and the testes. And so follicle-stimulating hormone, or FSH, see that it's actually going both to the testes and to the ovaries, right? Depending on which you have. So follicle-stimulating hormone. In males, it's going to stimulate a group of cells called nerve cells, and these are the cells that support the differentiation or the development of sperm. Okay? In females, follicle-stimulating hormone is going to talk to the ovary, and in particular, it tells a follicle to develop. And a follicle are all the cells around the actual developing egg. So it's pushing an egg towards maturity each month. It also, follicle-stimulating hormone, is going to stimulate the ovary to produce estrogen. All right, our other gonadotropin is luteinizing hormone. And again, luteinizing hormone goes to both the testes and the ovaries, depending on what you have. In males, this is what's going to actually be stimulating the androgen production, the testosterone production. In females, luteinizing hormone is what triggers ovulation. So once a month, the release of that egg. And it also stimulates both estrogen and progesterone production. So in females, follicle-stimulating hormone helps with estrogen, and then luteinizing hormone is estrogen and progesterone. Okay, melanocyte-stimulating hormone. So this is kind of a weird one. In fact, your book puts it with adrenocorticotropic hormone. They come from the same, basically, parent chemical. And this is kind of a weird one. It's basically inactive in adults. So notice here, uncertain significance in healthy adults. It's basically, right, melanocytes in adults get triggered by sunlight to produce more melanin. It looks like melanocyte-stimulating hormone is probably most important during fetal development. Sometimes you'll see pregnant women actually start to change their pigmentation due to the increased release of MSH. Oxytocin. Oh, we already did those. Okay. Who am I missing? Over here. Thyroid-stimulating hormone. Last but not least. So thyroid-stimulating hormone, sometimes called thyrotropin, it targets the thyroid gland, so that one's kind of nice, and it tells the thyroid gland to release thyroid hormones, which we'll talk more about. And again, it's being signaled to do so by the hypothalamus. Whew, that anterior pituitary is busy, isn't it? Okay, so that is the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland. I'll be back with some more.